Ramsey Avery, production designer for The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. Were you a big Lord of the Rings fan before this?
I was actually. I got introduced when I was a kid, about 10 years old, and it really was actually a very important part of my geeky young life and into teenagerhood. So definitely an underpinning, kind of in many ways, got me introduced into the whole world of fantasy and science fiction, which has kind of guided my whole career since.
Mhm. So how stoked were you when you got this gig?
Uh, very, very, very excited.
Well, I mean, there's obviously the books and the movies, but the show takes place in the Second Age, not the Third Age. So this is like the kingdoms in their heyday and they're thriving. So what kind of inspirations did you take, even from the movies themselves? Because like that shows like the aftermath when they're kind of like deteriorating.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a little bit of all of that actually. The trick really was to try to figure out what is the, like, John Howe, one of the illustrators who's worked on a lot of these projects, was defined it as trying to figure out what the DNA of Middle Earth would be and how we could grab onto that component for our world. It was very important to differentiate our Second Age from the Third Age, in that it really is, the Third Age is about the decay and the decline, and the Second Age is to be glorious, and looking at all these different cultures at the height of their capacities and their capabilities. And we that took the effort of acknowledging what lives in the films, because that's what the audience understands that it's going to. So you have to recognize that that is what's in people's heads. But then we went back as far as going into Tolkien's drawings themselves to see what he thought things looked like, and then looked at all the other artists, all the way starting back from when I was a kid. The Brothers Hildebrandt was what Middle Earth looked like. And that's not really what Middle Earth looks like now. And people said it looks much more like Alan Lee and John Howe's version of it. And there's Ted Naismith in the middle of all of that, and a whole bunch of other artists through there. So trying to pick through all of those different artists and those different representations and figure out what it is that makes Middle Earth feel epic and also feel lived in. That's one of the things that's really important. I think it works well in the movies, and I think it's really important in the books. Is like sometimes you know what Sam and Frodo had for lunch in the middle of nowhere. So that kind of specificity in terms of the world building, making sure that we could find what those elements were in what we brought to the Second Age.
mhm. I mean, it's second breakfast, right?
Yes, and Second Breakfast, true,
Yeah,
yes.
second breakfast. Yeah, well, there's also so many different kingdoms to keep track of too. But how did you go about differentiating the different cultures? Like obviously there's the elves, and it's more natural, their look, and then the dwarves, like it's their domiciles are grittier, and then there's a Numenor, which we've never even seen before. This like Atlantis-like world. So what was your approach to them?
A couple of steps for that. One was to try to figure out what we thought were the cultural key points for each culture. In that, like you said, each of these races come from someplace, and they come from someplace in Tolkien's words. So you can look back into that history. The elves first appeared when there wasn't even a sun or a moon. There were just stars in the sky, and they appeared in a forest, and they lived in that forest for time unmeasured, really. And so the idea that that's the basis of their sense of the world is stars and trees and nature, and everything kind of springs from that, as opposed to the dwarves, which are described, Tolkien says they're of stone and of flame. And so the idea that you look into those elements to see what the baseline of that is. And Harfoots, we know, have to hide, and they have to be able to be furtive. So how does that translate into what their world would look like? And the Numenorians build, and they are the most glorious development of a kind of representation of human as that you can imagine. And so what do those types of elements mean, just in terms of the basic underlying characteristic of each culture? And then looking into our real world to see what are the things that are cognates for that. How do we do nature that suggests architecture and forms and ornament of nature that doesn't get to Art Nouveau, but has that kind of resonance with Art Nouveau? So we, as people in the audience, can kind of recognize what it's about, but still understand that it's not 19th century France. It is Second Age Linden, and finding those differentials. Like we would take bits of Art Nouveau and blend it with Latin Celtic ancient architecture, and then look at photos of hyper macro photography of plants and try to figure out what's the kind of geometric blocks out of that we can take and build an ornament for Linden out of. So it was basically taking each culture, finding that underlining characteristic to define the culture, looking for real world elements in our history that we could relate to, massaging those ideas together, and then making sure that it fit within the story, because it could look as great as it wanted to look, but if it didn't tell the emotional beat of each scene that we were trying to get it to tell, it wasn't serving its purpose.
Sure. Well, Numenor specifically, it's so striking, and when they just enter it, it's so grand. So how many sets of that did you guys build? And the backstory of that is also like it's like men have descended on it now, and like the elves were there first, so it's like you have to do like the clash in cultures of that too. So what went into those designs?
Well, I guess there's kind of two questions in there. In terms of we developed a whole 3,000-year history of how architecture and ornament and culture evolved from the Elvish influence and the Valar helping the humans, and how that shifted over time to become less and less Elven and more human. And what that looked like at each step of the way. We had 4 different ages of architecture that we defined with either illustration or with reference and with words to help that define its way, color, so that you could see how it started at the lower levels being more Elvish, and as it went up higher on the cliffs, it got more mannish. Then in terms of what we built about a 4.5 acre backlot set for the city itself, which had streets and plazas and alleys and a wharf. All of that had to be able to turn into other things. The wharf actually became the Cantina Bridge. That the plaza became 3 different streets. So it was a matter of figuring out how to do one kind of unit backlot set that we could translate into a whole different parts of the city. And then we built multiple interior components. There was the court, there was the king's bedroom, which was turned into the Palantir room, and also a later scene in Eregion. We did the court and the king's bedroom, and then we did the prow dining room, which is kind of at the end of that big waterfall at the top of it. So we looked at those kind of components to what we could build and how we could repurpose it into other sets as well. The Hall of Lore is actually the dungeon, which is actually Celebrimber's workshop. So we ended up having
I love that workshop. It's like all the trinkets in there. It's like of a different time. I mean, like, yeah, but it's like it feels like a toy shop, I guess.
And that was part of that was too. We actually ended up having to do Celebrimber's workshop in there because we ran out of money to do another big set for that. So we had to figure out what we could use to turn into that. So that's how could we take the spareness of what we had done with the other 2 versions of the set and make it more feel like Celebrimber, the greatest craftsman of his age, had developed that into something that he felt comfortable in.
And I understand you guys built a ship too.
Yes, actually we built 2 ships. One of them was for the first trip to Valinor, the one that Galadriel jumps off of, and then we built a second ship that was the Numenorian ship, which was about 120 feet long-ish with all the gearing on it, and then it was on a gimbal, 6-axis gimbal, and it had the bottom 20 feet of sails on it, so they could actually be practical rigging with the sails. Pretty amazing when we finally got it there and started the big wind machines blowing on it and water machines, waves crashing onto it. We had actual sailors as extras, so they knew how to do the real rigging with it. It was really kind of a moment when they first that all started to come together. Was just a remarkably magical moment.
That's awesome. Well, season 1 filmed in New Zealand. Season 2 is going to be in England, or filming in England. Are you returning for the second season?
No, I'm not. All the scheduling stuff didn't work out for that, so I'm off into a whole different franchise.
Well, what do you hope to see as just a fan of season 2 and how they build upon your sets?
Well,
you do that handoff.
There were lots of things that we knew things were going to go south for both Numenor and for Eregion, right? So a lot of the talking that the showrunners and I did were talking about how we could develop it, looking into those future those future happenings. And I'm sure that things will shift and morph. So I'm very curious to see how those kind of kernels of ideas that we established in season 1 carry out into season 2 and season 3. Definitely Rune. I'm very excited to see what they do when they go to Rune. That was something we actually started to do in season 1, and then we let that drop away. We had too much going on in our season, so that was one of the storylines that shifted. So I'm very curious to see how that gets approached. Something again like Numenor, something we've never seen any representation of in a movie or a TV show. So I'll be really curious to see how that comes to life.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Ramsey, it was great speaking with you. Thanks so much for your time, and we'll see you back in a little bit.
Cool.
Thank you.